The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, folded twice and sealed with plain wax, and Milton Merritt read the single word "Relentless" 3 more times after the first before he set the paper down on his kitchen table and stared at the far wall of his ranch house for a long and reverent moment. He had placed the advertisement himself, back in February, through the matrimonial news out of Denver. He had written the words carefully, sitting at that same table with his boots off and a candle burning low, and he had described himself as best he could 31 years old, honest, in possession of a working cattle ranch outside the town of Caldwell, Kansas, which in those years sat right at the edge of everything civilized and everything wild. He had written that he was not a complicated man, but that he was a serious one, that he had no desire to deceive anyone, and that he was looking for a woman who understood what real work looked like. 3 responses had come over the following weeks. 2 were polite and sweet and forgettable in the way that perfectly nice things sometimes are. The 3rd was from a woman in Missouri named Augusta Kingsley, and her letter was unlike anything he had ever read from a woman in his life. She did not begin by describing her appearance, though she mentioned near the end that she was 27 and in good health. She did not list her domestic abilities in a soft and self-effacing way, though she mentioned that she could cook a proper meal and that she was not afraid of hard weather. What she did instead was begin the letter with a direct sentence that said she had read his advertisement and found it to be the most straightforward thing she had encountered in a very long time, and that straightforwardness was something she valued above almost everything else. Then she described her situation. She had been running her late father's dry goods store in a small town outside of Springfield for the past 3 years, since his death, and she had kept it profitable through 2 bad winters and a drought summer. And she had done this mostly alone because her brother had gone west and her mother had passed before her father. She wrote that she had always believed she was capable of more than the life her small town offered her, not because she was proud but because she was practical, and practicality demanded honesty about what a person was and what they needed. And then there was the word. She wrote it in the context of her nature, saying that several people who had known her since childhood had described her as relentless, and that she had come to believe this was the most accurate single word that existed for how she moved through the world. She did not apologize for it. She did not soften it with a following sentence about knowing when to stop or knowing her limits. She simply wrote the word and let it sit there on the page like a stone set in the middle of a road. Milton read it the first time and felt something in his chest shift sideways. He read it the second time and thought she probably meant it literally. He read it the 3rd time and realized that in 31 years, no one had ever described themselves to him in a way that made him feel like the description was actually true. He read it the 4th time and got up, found his best pen, and wrote the most thoughtful letter of his life. He wrote back to Augusta Kingsley that evening and told her the truth about his ranch, which was that it was 60 acres of decent grazing land on the south side of the Kaskaskia River, that he had a good herd of 60 cattle, and that he ran the operation himself with the help of 2 hired men named Deke Albright and Charlie Foss, who were reliable and hardworking if occasionally argumentative with each other. He wrote that the ranch house was solid but not fancy, that the nearest town of Caldwell was 6 miles east, and that Caldwell in 1882 was not what anyone would call a quiet place, sitting as it did at the tail end of the Kisham Trail where cattle drives still came through, and where a person could hear the noise of the stockyards on a still night. He wrote that he had chosen this land because it was good land, and because he believed in the future of the territory, even if the territory was rough around its current edges. He wrote that he had read her word 4 times, and that he thought it was the finest thing a person could say about themselves without vanity. He sent the letter and spent 2 weeks trying not to think about it, which meant he thought about almost nothing else. Her reply came on a Saturday morning, and he was in the barn when Charlie Foss rode up from the road with the post and called out to him. Milton came out of the barn with his hands covered in axle grease and took the letter, and read it leaning against the fence post while Charlie pretended to check his saddle. Augusta Kingsley wrote that she had laughed at his description of the two hired men being occasionally argumentative, because she had a feeling she would get along with them better than most people did. She wrote that she was interested in seeing the land and the house, and understanding what life there looked like in practice, and she wrote these things with the precise, clear-eyed tone of a woman making a genuine assessment rather than performing romantic interest. But at the end of the letter, almost as a quiet afterthought, she wrote that his reply had been the best letter she had received in a very long time, and that she had read his sentence about the word 4 times the same way he had read hers, which meant they were already even. Milton folded that letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He wrote back the same afternoon and asked her directly if she would consider coming to Caldwell in the second week of May, when the weather would be decent and the last of the spring drives would be passing through, so she could see the place as it actually was and not make any decisions based on imagination. He told her he would arrange for her to stay with his neighbor Hester Blackwood, who was a widow woman of good character and who had a spare room and would provide company that was not just 2 cattlemen and a ranch dog named Oberon. He said he understood if that seemed too forward or too fast, but that he thought people generally wasted too much time being cautious when the fundamental question was simple enough. Either a thing fit or it did not. Augusta Kingsley's next letter arrived 10 days later and contained 3 sentences. The first sentence said she had secured a buyer for the dry goods store, or rather that she had arranged a sale contingent on a 60-day closing period. The second sentence said she would be arriving in Caldwell on May the 14th on the Santa Fe line out of Wichita. The third sentence said she supposed he was right about the fundamental question. Milton Merritt read those 3 sentences standing at his kitchen table and then sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the wall again, but this time he was smiling. The weeks between the letter and the 14th of May moved the way time does when you are waiting for something real, slowly during the days and too quickly during the nights, so that you woke up some mornings feeling as though you had lost progress somehow. Milton worked the ranch with an energy that impressed both Deke and Charlie, mending fence lines that had needed attention since October, repainting the trim on the ranch house, ordering a new set of curtains from the mercantile in Caldwell, because the old ones were beyond redemption. Deke Albright, who was a lean and weathered man of 43 with a dry sense of humor that he deployed like a weapon, watched Milton hang the new curtains on a Sunday morning and said, very quietly and without looking up from the harness he was mending, that he reckoned those curtains cost more than a month's worth of beans. Milton said the old curtains had been an embarrassment to decent people and left it at that. Charlie Foss, who was 24 and generally more enthusiastic about everything than Deke, told Milton that he thought the whole mail-order business was romantic in a way that he found genuinely moving. Milton told Charlie that it was not the mail-order business. It was a correspondence between 2 adults who were thinking seriously about their lives, and Charlie said yes, that was what he had meant, and then grinned sideways at Deke. Caldwell, Kansas in 1882 was a place that wore its roughness openly. It sat on the border of Indian Territory and the state of Kansas, and the cattle trade had given it a vitality that was equal parts commerce and chaos. The main street had a hotel, 3 saloons, a land office, a hardware store, a barber shop, a newspaper office, and a doctor who was also the county coroner, which in those years in that town was not an unusual arrangement. There was a deputy marshal named Ruddy Teague, who was competent and reasonably honest, and a town marshal named Fenton Cole, who was more political than practical, but who kept things from getting entirely out of hand. It was into this place that Augusta Kingsley stepped off the Santa Fe line at 2:30 in the afternoon on May the 14th, carrying 2 large bags and a leather satchel, and looking around the platform with the clear-eyed attention of a woman taking inventory. Milton saw her the moment she stepped off the train because she was the kind of woman who was immediately visible in a crowd, not because of any particular prettiness, though she was certainly handsome, but because she moved like she had somewhere to be and had already decided she was going to get there. She was of middling height, dark-haired, with a straight back and a steady gaze that swept the platform without hesitation until it landed on him. He had written her a description of himself, so she would know him: tall, brown hair going to gray at the temples early, usually wearing a gray hat with a plain band, and he watched her eyes find him and stop. He walked toward her and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle of the platform, and there was a moment, a brief and weightless moment, where neither of them said anything at all, just looked at each other with the particular attention of 2 people who have been exchanging honest words for 2 months and are now, for the first time, exchanging them with their actual faces. She spoke first, which did not surprise him. She said, "You are taller than I imagined." He said, "You are exactly as I imagined." She tilted her head slightly and said, "That is either very flattering or very alarming." He said, "I meant it as a compliment. Your letters are very clear about who you are." Something in her expression, which had been carefully composed, shifted a degree toward warmth, and she said, "Well, that is a good start." He took the 2 bags, she kept the satchel, and he walked her to the wagon he had left at the hitching post outside the station. He had brought a pair of good horses, a bay and a roan, and the wagon was clean. He helped her up onto the seat, and she accepted the help without ceremony and settled herself, and looked around at the main street of Caldwell with the same appraising attention she had used on the platform. "It is louder than I expected," she said. "There is a drive coming through from Texas," he said. "About 2,000 head, I am told. It settles down once they have moved on." "Does it settle down much?" she asked, and the question was direct and genuine. "Some," he said honestly, "but not entirely. Caldwell is what it is. I can tell you that by September the season is mostly over and it gets quiet enough. It is never going to be Springfield." She looked at him and said, "I am not looking for Springfield. If I wanted Springfield, I would have stayed in Springfield." He clicked to the horses and they pulled out onto the street, and he thought that in all his 31 years, he had never had a conversation quite as efficient as this one. He took her to Hester Blackwood's place first, which was a well-kept farmhouse a mile west of the Merritt Ranch, and Hester came out onto the porch when she heard the wagon, a broad and capable woman of 58 who had outlasted a husband, a drought, and 2 different sets of neighbors she hadn't much cared for. Hester had agreed to host Augusta with a practicality that matched her character, saying only that she hoped the woman was sensible, and that she would need to pull her weight with the morning chores if she was going to be there more than 2 days. Augusta Kingsley and Hester Blackwood regarded each other for about 4 seconds on that porch, and then Hester said, "You look like you can manage a kitchen." And Augusta said, "I have been managing one since I was 14, and Hester nodded once and led her inside. Milton stood at the wagon and thought that was probably the best possible outcome. He came back the next morning to show Augusta the ranch, arriving at Hester's at 7:30 to find both women already in the kitchen with breakfast made, and a conversation in progress about the relative merits of different flour suppliers, a subject on which Augusta apparently had considerable and specific opinions. Hester looked up when he came in and said, "She knows her flour," in a tone of respect that Hester Blackwood did not give easily to anyone. They rode out to the ranch in the morning light, Augusta on the roan mare, whom she handled competently and without fuss, and Milton on the bay. The Chicaskia ran silver in the early sun, and the cattle were spread across the south pasture in the easy posture of animals that were well kept and comfortable, and Milton watched Augusta look at all of it: the land, the water, the herd, the house sitting back from the river with its new curtains visible through the windows, and he tried to read her face and could not quite. Deke Albright was leaning on the corral fence when they rode up, and he looked at Augusta with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who had spent his whole life reading weather and livestock and was now applying the same instinct to a person. Augusta looked back at him with the same directness. They regarded each other for a moment, and then Deke said, "You are the woman from Missouri." Augusta said, "I am." Deke nodded and said, "Good. Charlie has been talking about nothing else for 3 weeks." Charlie Foss came out of the barn at that moment, tripped over the threshold, caught himself, and said, "Good morning, Miss Kingsley," with a level of enthusiasm that made Augusta smile despite herself. Milton showed her the house. He showed her all of it, including the places that needed work and the roof corner that had a leak he hadn't gotten to yet, and the way the back bedroom got cold in January because the insulation in the wall was not adequate. He showed her these things deliberately, and she looked at them and asked practical questions about cost and timeline, and she never once winced or made a face that suggested any of it was beyond acceptable. At the end of the tour, standing in the kitchen, she put her hands flat on the work table and looked at the window that faced south toward the river and was quiet for a long moment. He waited. He had learned already that her silences were working silences and that interrupting them was not useful. She said finally, "The land is beautiful." He said, "Yes." She said, "The house is workable." He said, "It is." She turned and looked at him and said, "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Merritt." He said, "Please." She said, "I have been practical my whole life and I have not apologized for it. I have thought about your letters, and I have thought about this place, and I have thought about myself and what I want and what I am capable of building. I think that you are genuinely who you presented yourself to be, which is not as common as it should be." He said, "Neither are you." She looked at him for a moment and said, "I think we could make something real here. I want to say that plainly." He said, "I want you to know that I feel the same. I have felt it since the first letter." She said, "Then we are agreed on the fundamental question." He said, "I believe we are." She put her hand out across the work table and he took it, and they shook hands, and it was both the most formal and the most intimate thing that had ever happened in his kitchen. The days that followed were not uncomplicated ones. Augusta was staying at Hester's and coming to the ranch each day, learning its rhythms, its demands, its small daily economies. She worked alongside Hester in the mornings and alongside Milton in the afternoons, and she asked questions about everything: the cattle, the grazing rotation, the relationship with the beef buyers who came up from Wichita, the politics of the water rights that ran along the river. She learned fast and she retained everything, and she never asked the same question twice. On the 4th day she rode with Milton to Caldwell to deal with a supply order, and they walked the main street together, and he watched the town look at them, at her, with the particular attention that a small, rough place gives to a new woman. It was not entirely comfortable, but Augusta moved through it the way she moved through everything, with a directness that declined to acknowledge any discomfort and therefore deflected most of it. They were coming out of the hardware store when a man named Percy Webb, who ran the middle saloon, and who had the specific kind of confidence that came from being loud in a loud place, stepped off the saloon porch and looked at Augusta, and said something to his companion that was audible and not kind. Milton went still. Augusta stopped walking, turned, and looked at Percy Webb with an expression that was absolutely calm and absolutely not deferential, and said, in a clear and carrying voice, "Is there something you need to say to me directly, sir?" Percy Webb looked at her, and then looked at the expression on her face, and then looked at Milton, who had not moved but whose stillness was the kind that precedes something, and Percy Webb found something interesting to look at across the street. Augusta turned back and continued walking. Milton caught up with her and said quietly, "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know I did not have to. I wanted to. There is a difference." He thought about the word in her first letter and thought that yes, of course there was. That evening he drove her back to Hester's in the fading light of a May evening that was the color of embers, the sky going orange in deep rose along the western horizon, where the plains stretched out flat and endless toward the territories. They sat for a moment on the wagon seat outside Hester's gate, not hurrying, and Augusta looked at the sky with an expression that was the most unguarded he had yet seen on her. She said, "I did not expect the sky to be like this." He said, "No one does the first time." She said, "In Springfield the sky is always cut up by trees and buildings. Here it is just there," he said. "It takes some getting used to, but I find that once you are used to it you cannot really go back." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I do not think I would want to." He looked at her profile against that enormous sky and felt something that was more than the fondness he had been carefully managing since she arrived, something that lived lower and steadier than fondness, something that had weight and seriousness to it. And he thought that he was going to have to be very careful with himself if he did not want to be more obvious than was prudent at this stage. He helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the gate and said good night. And she said good night, and she went inside. And he drove home under that sky thinking about the word relentless and thinking that he understood now, having seen her move through 4 days of a real place, exactly what it meant in practice, and that the meaning of it was the finest thing he had ever seen. On the 6th day something happened that was not in anyone's plans. A cattle drive came through from Texas, a big one, over 2,000 head of longhorns moving up the last stretch of the Kishom Trail toward the Caldwell stockyards. The drives were a fact of life in that part of Kansas in those years, and Milton had lived beside them for 7 years and knew their rhythms. But this one had trouble in it. The trail boss, a man named Augusta Greer, was moving the cattle too fast and too tired, pushing to make the yards before a competing drive that was 2 days behind him. The herd came through the eastern edge of Milton's grazing land at a flat run, driven by exhausted cowboys who had been in the saddle for 18 hours, and the lead steers broke through the fence line on the east pasture and scattered across the south grass before anyone could stop them. Milton was in the field when it happened and went to work immediately, he and Deke and Charlie riding hard to contain the breach and push his own cattle away from the mixing mass of longhorns. Augusta was at the ranch house when she heard the commotion and came out, took one look at the situation, went back to the barn, saddled the roan without hesitation, and rode out into the chaos. Milton saw her coming, and his first instinct was alarm, because a frightened cattle drive in full movement was genuinely dangerous. But his alarm lasted only until he saw how she rode, not recklessly, but with the kind of controlled decisiveness that meant she understood what she was doing and had made a considered judgment about where she could be useful. She positioned herself on the left flank of the scattered group, exactly where the gap in the containment was widest, and worked the roan back and forth along that edge with a steadiness that held the line and gave Deke the room to push around the far side. It took 90 minutes to sort out. When it was over, the longhorns were continuing north toward Caldwell, the Merritt cattle were back in the south pasture, and the fence line had 3 sections down that would need 2 days of work to repair. Augusta Greer rode over with his hat in his hand and made a lengthy and genuine apology that included an offer to pay for the fence damage, and Milton accepted the offer without drama because it was a fair one, and because he had neither the time nor the inclination for a range war. When Greer had ridden off, Milton turned and looked at Augusta, who was sitting the roan easy and looking at the downed fence line with the calm expression of a woman calculating what it would take to fix it. He said, "You did not have to do that." She turned and looked at him and said, "You are going to have to stop saying that to me." He said, "You are going to have to stop giving me reasons to say it." She held his gaze for a moment, and then something happened in her expression that was completely different from anything he had yet seen, a softness, quick and unplanned, like a door briefly opened and then remembered and almost but not quite closed again. She said, "Is that a complaint?" He said, "It is the opposite of a complaint." They looked at each other across the wrecked fence line in the afternoon light with the smell of cattle and dry grass around them, and the silence between them was a particular kind of silence that had meaning in it, that was not empty but full. Charlie Foss broke it by riding over and saying that he thought 3 sections could be repaired before dark if they started now, and they started now. That evening, after supper, Milton and Augusta sat on the porch of the ranch house while Deke and Charlie were in the bunkhouse, and the night was coming in cool and clear with stars appearing one by one overhead, and the sound of the river running soft in the distance. Augusta had a cup of coffee and Milton had one too, and they sat in the rocking chairs he had put on the porch 3 years ago, intending to use them more than he had. Augusta said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why have you not married before this? You are 31 and you have good land and you are an honest person and you are not lacking for anything that a person needs. So why not before?" He thought about it, the way he thought about things that deserved real thinking, and said, "I think I was waiting for someone who was not performing a version of themselves for my benefit. Every woman I met in the normal way of things seemed to be showing me a specific arrangement of themselves, the arrangement that was supposed to appeal, which is understandable, that is what people do. But I found I could not build a real life on a performance. I needed to know who was actually there." She was quiet for a moment and then said, "And you thought you might find that through a letter?" He said, "I thought a letter gave a person less to perform with. There is no dress and no smile and no tone of voice. There is just what you say and how you say it," she said, "and the word." He said, "And the word." She looked at the stars and said, "I was engaged once, 6 years ago. He was a decent man and I think he genuinely cared for me, but he spent a lot of his time trying to make me smaller than I was. Not deliberately, I think, but consistently. He would say things that were meant kindly, but that translated underneath to, 'You would be easier to love if you were less.'" She paused. "I ended it. My father was not pleased, but I knew that I could not become smaller for anyone, not sustainably, not honestly." Milton said, "Your father's opinion changed." She said, "He came around eventually. He was a practical man at heart. He told me, the winter before he died, that I had been right and that he had been wrong, and that he was proud of me, and that was enough." He said, "That must have meant a lot," she said. "It was the best thing he ever said to me." They were quiet together for a while, a good quiet, a comfortable one, and the stars continued to appear until the whole sky was dense with them. He said, "I am not going to try to make you smaller." She turned and looked at him, and her expression was very direct and very still. He said, "I want to be clear about that. I read your word 4 times and I understood it the 4th time the same way I understood it the first, as a description of a person who is exactly who they say they are. I would not have written back if I had been hoping for someone else." She said, "I believe you." He said, "I am glad." She looked back at the stars and said, very quietly, "I am too." He wanted to reach across the space between the 2 rocking chairs and take her hand. He did not yet, because he thought there was more time and he wanted to do things in the right order. But the wanting of it was very clear and very present, and it sat in his chest like something warm. The following 4 days were the best 4 days Milton Merritt had spent in 7 years on the Kansas plain. He and Augusta fell into a rhythm that felt less like 2 people getting acquainted, and more like 2 people recognizing something, in each other, in the land, in the shape of the days. She rose early and spent her mornings with Hester, and came to the ranch by 9 and worked until dusk and asked questions that were sharp and useful and made observations that he found himself writing down afterward because they were too good to lose. She noticed, on the second of those days, that the way the cattle were being rotated through the pastures was leaving one section of the river bank overused, and suggested moving the rotation earlier in the cycle. He looked at what she was describing and realized she was entirely correct, and that he had been looking at the bank all spring without seeing what she had seen in 2 days. And he changed the rotation, and felt the slightly humbling and entirely pleasant feeling of being genuinely helped. She noticed, on the 3rd day, that Charlie Foss, beneath his easy cheerfulness, had a sadness about him that seemed deep and old, and she mentioned it to Milton at the end of the day with a careful concern that was not gossip but genuine observation. Milton told her that Charlie had lost his mother and his younger sister to fever 2 winters back, and that he had come to work the ranch in the spring after that, and that Deke Albright, who was gruff and unsentimental on the surface, had quietly and without acknowledgement made himself into a kind of substitute older brother to the boy. Augusta listened to this and was quiet for a moment, and then said she would bring a proper meal over to the bunkhouse sometime that week, not making a big thing of it, just food. Milton said that was a fine idea. She did it on the 4th evening, and watched Deke eat 3 helpings of the beef stew she had made without once acknowledging that it was the best thing he had eaten in a year, and watched Charlie eat his and be visibly moved by it in the way of young men who are sad and not always sure what to do about it. And she said nothing that made anything awkward, just sat at the bunkhouse table with them, and talked about the cattle and the weather and the coming summer, and let the meal be what it was. On the way back to the ranch house afterward, walking in the dark with a lantern, Milton said, "You are good with people." She said, "I was in retail for 3 years. I learned that most people want to be seen without the seeing being too obvious." He said, "That is a very kind way to be." She said, "It is a practical way to be, which sometimes amounts to the same thing." He thought about the way the lantern light moved across her face when she said it, and thought about saying something about how he felt, and then thought better of it. Not because the feeling was not there, but because he wanted to say it right when he said it, wanted to be sure the words were as accurate as the words she had used for herself. On the morning of the 10th day of her visit, Augusta told Milton that she had received a letter from the man buying her store in Springfield, and that the sale was proceeding, and that she would need to return within 2 weeks to finalize the papers. She told him this at the kitchen table over the morning coffee, directly and without drama, but he heard something in the way she said it that was careful, that was managing something. He said, "When you go back, are you planning to come back here?" She looked at him across the table and said, "That depends." He said, "On what?" She said, "On whether you are going to ask me something before I leave or whether you are planning to let the situation continue in the current undefined state." He looked at her for a moment and thought that she was the most remarkable person he had ever sat across a table from, and that he was going to be an absolute fool if he wasted another day in caution. He said, "Augusta," she said. "Yes." He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I want to be clear that I am not asking because you are leaving or because the timeline is pressing or for any reason other than that in 10 days you have shown me exactly who you said you were in your first letter, and who you are is the person I want to build this life with, this ranch and everything on it. I want to build it with you." She looked at him. She was very still. That working silence of hers. He waited. She said, "I want to tell you something first." He said, "All right." She said, "I decided before I boarded that train that I was either going to find something real here or I was going to go home and do something else entirely, because I was not going to spend my life making a safe, manageable choice that didn't fit me. And when I stepped off that train and you were standing there looking exactly like someone who meant everything they said and nothing they didn't, I thought that this was either going to be very good or very complicated." She paused. "It has been both." He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "Yes, that is a yes." He pushed back from the table and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And the morning sun was coming through the south window across the new curtains, and Oberon the ranch dog was lying in the doorway, and outside the cattle were grazing, and the river was running, and everything that was real was exactly where it was supposed to be. The 2 weeks that followed her return to Springfield were the longest 2 weeks of Milton Merritt's life. She wrote him 2 letters, short practical ones about the status of the sale and the packing of her belongings, but each one contained 1 sentence near the end that was not about logistics. The first said that she had told Hester she was coming back and that Hester had said good. She needed someone to debate flour with. The second said that she had found a good home for the store cat, whose name was Horatio, and who had the temperament of a small feudal lord, and that she was sad to leave him, but that she thought a working cattle ranch was probably not his environment. Milton wrote back to each letter, and his replies were longer and less practical and more honest than anything he had ever written to anyone. And by the time he sealed the second one, he had stopped managing the feeling in his chest and was simply living in it. Augusta returned to Caldwell on the 3rd of June, 1882, with 4 trunks, 2 bags, a leather satchel, and a calm determination that had an almost physical solidity to it. Milton met her at the platform again, and this time when they met in the middle there was no pause, no taking of inventory. She put her hand on his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood there for a moment in the middle of the Caldwell station platform, while the world moved around them. They were married on the 21st of June by the circuit preacher, a long-faced and surprisingly funny man named Reverend Elias Crane, who performed the ceremony in the parlor of Hester Blackwood's farmhouse with Hester and Deke and Charlie as witnesses. Hester had made a cake with dried apricots that was genuinely exceptional, and that Deke ate 2 pieces of while maintaining a facial expression of complete neutrality. Charlie cried briefly, and then looked at the ceiling and composed himself and congratulated them both with a warmth that was entirely sincere. Augusta wore a blue dress the color of the evening sky, and Milton wore the good coat he had last worn to a land negotiation in Wichita 3 years ago, which still fit. And when Reverend Crane said the words, and they exchanged their vows, Milton looked at Augusta, and she looked at him, and they both said what they said with the plain directness that was the most natural language either of them spoke. When it was done, Reverend Crane said, "I have been doing this for 22 years, and I have rarely met 2 people more suited to each other, and I say that as a professional assessment, not a pleasantry." Hester said, "He's right. I've been watching for 2 weeks." Deke said nothing, but he raised his cup of cider and drank it, and with Deke Albright that was about as much as anyone was going to get. They drove back to the Merritt ranch, their ranch, in the long midsummer evening, the sky going on forever above them in every shade of gold and blue, and Augusta sat beside him on the wagon seat and put her head against his shoulder and said nothing at all for the 6 miles, and he drove slowly and felt the warm weight of her beside him, and thought that this was what the word had meant, all along, not just the relentless forward motion of a person through a difficult world, but the relentlessness of a person moving towards something true. The first year of their marriage was the richest education of Milton's adult life. Augusta brought to the ranch everything she had said she would bring: her practical intelligence, her clarity, her relentless attention to the details that made the difference between a thing working and a thing failing. Within 3 months, she had reorganized the supply ordering system so that they were no longer running short of critical materials at inconvenient times, had negotiated a better price with their primary beef buyer in Wichita by the simple mechanism of preparing for the negotiation with actual numbers rather than general good faith, and had established a kitchen garden behind the house that by August was producing more than the 2 of them could use, which meant she was trading vegetables with Hester and with 2 other neighbors and building the kind of goodwill that in a rough place was as valuable as money. She also learned the cattle work. She had come in with a solid general competence. She could ride. She could manage a horse. She understood the basic operations. But she wanted to understand the specifics, and she spent the first summer asking Deke questions in the direct, unhurried way she had. And Deke, who did not give respect easily, gave it to her by the end of July in the form of answering her questions as though she were a working rancher and not a guest. One afternoon in late August, Milton came in from the north pasture to find Augusta and Deke in an extended and serious conversation about the condition of 3 cattle that had been showing signs of foot rot, and Augusta was making specific suggestions about treatment based on something she had read in a stockman's almanac she had sent away from a publisher in St. Louis, and Deke was listening with the focused attention of a man who recognized when someone was saying something worth hearing. Milton stood at the barn door for a moment and watched this, and felt a happiness that was so complete it was almost startling. There were difficult things, too. Caldwell in 1882 and 1883 was not a peaceful place. The cattle trade brought money, and it brought men who were rough and sometimes dangerous, and there was violence in the town that spilled over occasionally into the outlying farms and ranches. There was a night in September when a group of men who had been drinking in Caldwell came through the ranch road loudly enough to wake them both, and Milton sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees until they moved on, and Augusta sat beside him with her own rifle that she had brought from Missouri and that she could use, which he had discovered and not been surprised by. She had been sitting there in the dark for 20 minutes before he said, "You do not have to sit out here," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said. "Of course," she said. "I am your wife. This is my porch too." He said, "Yes, it is." They sat there until the sound faded down the road, and then they went back inside, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the darkness of the bedroom and said, "I am not afraid here." He said, "No," she said. "No, I am settled here. I feel like myself here in a way I'm not sure I have ever felt anywhere." He put his arm around her and said, "Good. Because I find I am more myself with you here than I was for 31 years before you arrived." She said, "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He said, "I have been working on it since January." She laughed, and he had heard her laugh many times by then, but it still had the quality of something unexpected and genuinely delightful, warm and real, and a little surprised at itself. There were harder things too, things that demanded a different kind of steadiness. In the winter of 1882, a dry cold that came down from the north in November and didn't lift until March, they lost 11 cattle to cold and illness. It was not a catastrophic loss, but it was a real one, and Milton felt it the way any rancher feels the death of animals they have tended, with a quiet grief that was practical and personal at the same time. Augusta did not try to minimize it or rush past it. She kept the accounts with him, and they looked at the numbers together and made the decisions that needed making about restocking in the spring, about adjusting the winter shelter situation so it would not happen the same way again. And she was with him in it with a fullness that he had not experienced before with anyone, the fullness of someone who is actually present in a difficulty rather than adjacent to it. There was also the question of the water rights on the south section of the river, which had been simmering since before Augusta arrived, and which came to a head in February of 1883, when a man named Holloway, who was buying up land east of the river with an eye toward a larger operation, filed a claim at the land office in Caldwell that encroached on water access that Milton had been using and depending on for 7 years. Augusta was the one who found out about the filing, because she had made a habit of reading the land office notices in the Caldwell newspaper with the same attention she had once given to her store ledgers, and she brought the notice to Milton at breakfast and laid it in front of him and said, "You need to read this today, not tomorrow." He read it and felt the particular anger of a man whose livelihood is being challenged by someone with money and indifference, and then he set the paper down and looked at Augusta, who was watching him with an expression that was attentive and clear. She said, "I have been thinking about it since I saw it last night." He said, "And?" She said, "The key is the 1876 water grant. You were here before Holloway and your prior use predates his claim, but you need documentation. Do you have the original grant paperwork?" He said, "Yes, I have it. In the cabinet in the study." She said, "Then we take it to the land office today and we file a counter notice and we contact the county land agent, and we do this correctly and promptly because Holloway's people are going to move fast." He said, "You have been thinking about this since last night." She said, "I told you I was relentless." He looked at her and thought that he had read the word 4 times in a letter before he knew her, and that he would spend the rest of his life understanding what it meant in new ways, and that each new way was better than the last. They drove to Caldwell that morning and filed the counter notice and contacted the county land agent, and by the end of the day had the situation properly documented and legally clear. And Holloway's claim, presented to a proper legal review, did not survive contact with the 1876 water grant that predated it. It took 3 months of back and forth, during which Augusta continued to read every relevant piece of correspondence with the focused attention of a lawyer, though she had no legal training whatsoever. And by the end of March, the water rights were confirmed, and Holloway had adjusted his claims to land that did not encroach on the Merritt water. Deputy Marshal Ruddy Teague, who had watched the proceedings with the interest of a man who appreciated when things were done right, said to Milton one afternoon outside the land office that his wife was the sharpest person he had encountered in Caldwell in some years, and that this was a specific and meaningful compliment, given the range of people who came through Caldwell. Milton said he was entirely correct and went home and told Augusta, and watched her expression do the thing it did when she was genuinely pleased. A small, real smile, not performed, that lived mostly around her eyes. Spring of 1883 came in green and generous after the hard winter, and the cattle restocking went well. Milton bought 23 good animals from a breeder south of Wichita, who had a reputation for quality that the price reflected, but that the subsequent health of the animals justified. And by April the herd was back to strength, and the south pasture was fully recovered from the previous year's overuse. Partly due to the rotation adjustment Augusta had suggested in her second week on the ranch. It was in April that Augusta told Milton she was expecting. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning, in the same direct way she told him everything, but with something in her eyes that was soft and wondering and a little awed, the same quality she had looking at the western sky on her first evening. He was quiet for a moment, not because he was unhappy, but because the feeling was so large it required a moment to be properly inhabited. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands and held them, and she looked up at him and he said, "Augusta," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am so glad you sent that letter." She smiled, and it was the fullest smile he had seen from her, the one that was entirely unguarded and entirely real, and she said, "So am I." The pregnancy was not easy, and Augusta did not pretend it was. She was unwell through June in a way that she found frustrating because she did not like being unable to work at full capacity, and she pushed herself as much as she reasonably could and then pushed a little more, and Milton worried and tried to express it in ways that were useful rather than anxious. Hester Blackwood came over often, partly out of affection, and partly because Hester had practical knowledge of childbirths and pregnancies that she conveyed to Augusta in the same matter-of-fact way that she had conveyed information about flour suppliers, and Augusta received it with gratitude and retained it and acted on it. Charlie Foss, who had become in the year since Augusta's arrival something genuinely like a younger brother, took on extra work during the difficult weeks without being asked, and without making anything of it, and Augusta knew perfectly well what he was doing and why. And once, on an evening in July when she was feeling better and they were all sitting on the ranch house porch together, she and Milton and Deke and Charlie, she said to Charlie, "I want you to know that I notice what you do and that it matters." And Charlie looked at the ground and said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that was slightly strangled, and Deke looked at the middle distance with an expression of complete composure. The baby was born on the 4th of December, 1883, in the ranch house, with Hester presiding and Milton present, which was not the custom of the time but which Augusta had stated plainly that she wanted, and which Milton had stated plainly that he intended, and Hester, who had her own views about conventions, had said fine, as long as he was useful and not decorative. The baby was a boy. They named him James Walter Merritt, James for Augusta's father and Walter for Milton's, and he arrived in the world in the December darkness with a considerable amount of noise that Oberon the ranch dog, waiting outside the bedroom door, received with a long and thoughtful stare at the door, and then a lowering of his large head back onto his paws with the air of a philosopher accepting a new development. Milton held his son for the first time in the early morning in the lamplight, and Augusta watched him from the bed with an expression of exhausted and complete happiness and said, "He looks like you," Milton said. "He looks like a person who has opinions about things." Augusta said, "That is the most diplomatic way to describe that expression." He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and put his free arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at James Walter Merritt, who had stopped making noise and was now regarding the world with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Augusta said, "He has your eyes." Milton said, "He has your way of looking at things." She said, "Poor boy." He said, "Lucky boy." The years moved in the way that good years move, with a fullness that is only really visible in retrospect, each season building on the one before it in the patient accumulation of a life that is genuinely inhabited. The ranch grew. By 1885 they had 90 cattle and had added a second barn and extended the fencing on the north section, and the kitchen garden had evolved into something large enough to supply not only their household but a regular trade with 2 families nearby. Augusta had begun keeping careful records of the ranch's finances in a ledger system she had designed herself, and the records showed, with the clarity that good records have, that the operation had become more profitable each year since she arrived. James Walter Merritt grew into a child of energy and curiosity, who followed Deke Albright around the ranch with the faithful devotion of a small shadow, and who by age 2 had the vocabulary of a child somewhat older and the physical confidence of someone who had grown up on open land and understood it in the body. Deke, who had never been known for particular warmth toward children, turned out to have a patient and quiet quality with James that surprised everyone, including probably Deke himself. He taught the boy to recognize the different cattle by their markings before James was 3, and he did it with a seriousness that the boy responded to, because James, like his mother, was responsive to being taken seriously. Charlie Foss, who had continued to work the ranch through all these years, had by 1885 grown into a young man of 27 who was steadier and more capable than he had been when Augusta arrived, the grief of his losses still present in him, but no longer the primary fact about him. In the spring of 1885, he met a young woman named Nell Hartley at the Caldwell General Store, where she had recently come to work, and the process by which he fell in love with her was visible to the entire Merritt household, being characterized by a level of transparency that Deke described, once, as like watching a lamp try to hide in a dark room. Milton and Augusta said nothing about it except to invite Nell to the ranch for supper twice in May, and she came, and she was sensible and warm and clearly fond of Charlie, and Augusta told Milton in private that she thought it would be fine. It was fine. Charlie and Nell were married in July of 1885 in the Caldwell church, and Milton and Augusta stood as witnesses, and Augusta wore the blue dress she had been married in because she could and because she liked it, and Milton thought she was more beautiful in it now than she had been the first time, which was not a small statement. Deke Albright at the wedding made a toast that was 11 words long. "Charlie, you did good. Nell, the same applies to you." Then he sat back down and ate cake. In the autumn of 1885, Augusta told Milton she was expecting again. They were in the kitchen. It was always the kitchen, he thought, with them. And she told him with the directness she always used, and with the same soft, wondering quality she'd had the first time, and he went around the table and held her the same way. And James Walter, now almost 2, was sitting on the floor attempting to teach Oberon something, and looked up at his parents with the tolerant expression of a very small person who has accepted that adults are occasionally inexplicable. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, and on a warm evening in May 1886, in the ranch house bedroom, their second child was born, a girl this time, dark-haired and serious from her first moments in a way that made Hester Blackwood, who was present again, say she had Augusta's face already, and God help anyone who ever tried to argue with her. They named her Clara Ruth Merritt. Augusta cried when she held her, not loudly but genuinely, the quiet tears of a woman who had moved toward everything she wanted with the full force of her nature and had arrived. And she looked at Milton over the baby's dark head and said, "We built something good here." He sat beside her and put his hand against her face and said, "We did. We are." He meant both. The ranch continued to grow through the late 1880s. The cattle trade out of Caldwell was changing. The great era of the trail drives was winding down as the railroads pushed deeper into Texas and made the long drives less necessary, and the nature of the cattle business was shifting toward more settled and scientific ranching, and Milton and Augusta shifted with it. They were early in adopting better breeding practices, selecting bulls with more attention than had been common on the plains, and the quality of the Merritt herd became known among buyers in Wichita as consistently superior, which meant better prices than the average. Augusta's ledger system had, by 1887, become a kind of legend in the local ranching community. She had refined it over 4 years into something that could track not only income and expenditure but grazing yield per section, cattle health metrics, and feed cost ratios, and 2 neighboring ranchers asked her to help them set up similar systems for their own operations, which she did, charging a fair price for the work and doing it well. Caldwell itself was changing too. The roughest years of the cattle trade were behind it, and while it retained its character, it was becoming more of a settled town and less of a wild one. The Marshall situation stabilized. The saloons were still there, but they were competing with a new hotel and a schoolhouse that had opened in 1884, and a dry goods store that had been established by a husband and wife from Ohio who were determined and capable. Augusta had a particular fondness for the dry goods store, which she never entirely articulated but which Milton understood had to do with her father and with the store in Springfield, and with the continuous thread of a life that had moved forward without losing its origins. In 1888, when James was 4 and Clara was 2, Augusta told Milton she wanted to talk to him about something. They were on the porch in the evening, the same porch, the same rocking chairs, though the chairs had been repaired twice and refinished once, and she had the slightly particular expression she wore when she had been thinking about something for a while and had organized it. He said, "Tell me," she said, "I want to build a proper schoolroom on the ranch. Not replace the Caldwell school, but for the early years before James is old enough to ride to town every day, and for Clara, and for the Foss children when they come." Charlie and Nell had a baby of their own now, a boy named Henry who was 8 months old and whom Deke had already taken to the corral to look at the horses, which was Deke's version of a welcoming ceremony. Milton said, "How big are you thinking?" she said. "1 room, south side of the house, good light. Big enough for 6 children without being crowded." He said, "Do you want to teach them yourself?" she said. "I want to teach them the foundations myself. I have been reading the education materials from the normal school in Emporia, and I think I can do it well for the first several years. And then I want to send them to the Caldwell school with a real basis already established." He said, "You have been thinking about this for a while," she said, "since Clara was born." He said, "Then we build it." She looked at him and said, "Just like that," he said, "Augusta, in 6 years have I ever once doubted one of your ideas after you explained the thinking behind it?" She considered. She said, "No." He said, "Then you already knew what I was going to say. You just wanted to say it out loud first." She was quiet for a moment and then she smiled, the real one, the one around her eyes, and said, "Yes, I suppose I did." The schoolroom was built that autumn. A good, clean 1-room addition on the south side of the house, exactly as she had described, with 4 windows and good shelving for the books she ordered from a publisher in Kansas City. Augusta taught her children in it with the same combination of directness and care that she brought to everything. And when James Walter Merritt rode to the Caldwell school for the first time at the age of 7, his teacher sent a note home after the first week saying he was the most prepared first student she had encountered in her years of teaching, which Augusta received without surprise, and which Milton received with a pride he made no effort to conceal. Deke Albright, who had been with the ranch now for 9 years, developed a bad knee in the winter of 1889 that limited his writing but not his other work, and Milton quietly reduced the physical demands of Deke's role without making anything of it, reorganizing the work distribution in a way that made Deke's contribution still valuable and still necessary, because it was. Deke knew perfectly well what was being done and said nothing about it except one evening to Augusta, who had been the one who had figured out the reorganization, because of course she had, he said, "You are a better manager than most people I have worked for in 40 years. Augusta said, "Thank you, Deke." "You are a better rancher than most people I have met in my life." Deke nodded once, which was Deke's version of an extended and emotional exchange. The 1890s came in with changes that reached even to the Chicaskia River and the Merritt Ranch. The Homestead Act's long shadow was still moving across the territory, and the land around them was filling in with settlers, which was not bad in itself, but changed the character of the place. The open range that had defined the cattle trade was becoming fenced and settled, and the great era of the trail drives was fully over. But the Merritt Ranch, which had been built from the beginning with a more settled model, adapted without the upheaval that hit many larger operations that had been built on the assumption that the open range was permanent. Caldwell was becoming, by the early 1890s, a recognizable town rather than a frontier outpost, with a proper school and a church and 2 churches, and a growing commercial street that would not have been out of place in any small Kansas town, except that it carried in its bones the history of the trail years and the people who had survived them. Augusta and Milton were among those people, and the town knew it. Milton Merritt's word was considered reliable in any business dealing, and Augusta Merritt had by 1891 a reputation in the local community that was both respected and slightly awed, because she had a record of being right about most things, and she did not say things she was not prepared to stand behind. She was also, in the way of people who are genuinely good at their work, generous with what she knew. She helped 3 neighboring farm wives set up household account systems. She consulted on a small land dispute between 2 families on the east side of the river, with a clear-headedness that resulted in an agreed resolution that both parties found fair. She organized, in the winter of 1891, a supply-sharing arrangement between 4 ranching families for the purchase of winter feed in bulk, which reduced everyone's cost by a meaningful amount. These were not grand gestures, but they were real ones, and they built the kind of standing that is built slowly and cannot be faked. One evening in January of 1892, sitting by the fire after the children were in bed, James was 8 and Clara was 5, and both were asleep in the good, warm bedrooms of the house they had grown up in. Augusta looked up from the book she was reading and said, "Milton." He looked up from the ranch records he was reviewing. She said, "Are you happy?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Completely," he said, "as completely as I have ever been, more completely than I knew how to be before you." She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was so fully hers, the one that was honest and direct, and underneath it, warm as anything in the world. She said, "I think about that letter sometimes, my first letter to you." He said, "I do too." She said, "I almost did not send it. I had written 3 other drafts before that one, and they were all perfectly reasonable and appropriate, and I threw them all away because they sounded like someone performing reasonableness, not like me." He said, "What made you send the one you sent?" She said, "I decided that if I was going to do this thing, I was going to do it honestly, and if the honesty was too much for the person on the other end, then he was the wrong person, and I would know quickly, which would save both of us time." He said, "That was very practical." She said, "It was very relentless." He said, "Yes, it was, and I am grateful for it every day." She put the book down and came across the room and sat beside him, which she did not often do when they were both settled in the evenings, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat by the fire in the long, comfortable silence of two people who have built something true together. She said quietly, "I love you. I know I do not say it in the dramatic way that novels require, but I want to say it clearly." He said, "I love you too, as clearly as I know how to say it." She said, "That is enough. That is more than enough." Outside, the Kansas winter was doing what Kansas winters do, blowing cold and clear across the flat land, and inside the fire was warm and the house was full of the particular quiet of a sleeping household that was genuinely at peace. The spring of 1892 brought with it a decision that had been building for a while in Augusta's thinking. She told Milton on a March morning, again at the kitchen table, because the kitchen table was where their most important conversations lived, that she wanted to formally apply for a position on the newly formed Caldwell School Board. Milton looked at her and said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" she said. "About a year. The board was formed last autumn, and I have watched how it operates, and I believe there are things I can contribute to how the school is run and how the teachers are supported." He said, "You would be the first woman on that board." She said, "Yes." He said, "That will not be simple." She said, "No, but the right things rarely are." He said, "Are you asking my opinion or telling me your decision?" She said, "I am telling you my decision and inviting your response." He said, "My response is that you should do it and that you will be very good at it and that anyone who has trouble with the first woman on the Caldwell School Board will not have the trouble with me." She said, "You do not need to fight my battles." He said, "I know, but I can stand beside you while you fight them yourself." She looked at him across the table, that direct, clear look, and said, "That is exactly the right answer," she applied. There was resistance, as there was always resistance to things that had not been done before, from men who had specific ideas about the correct division of public and domestic life. But Augusta Kingsley Merritt presented her qualifications: 6 years of running a successful commercial enterprise, 4 years of primary education in her own schoolroom, a detailed written assessment of the current school's strengths and needs, with the same organized clarity she brought to everything. And the board, which was composed of men who were practical at heart, voted 3-2 to appoint her. She served on the Caldwell School Board for 11 years, and in that time she was instrumental in bringing 2 additional teachers to the school, improving the school building's heating situation, establishing a small lending library that was the first of its kind in the county, and organizing a curriculum review that modernized what was being taught in the upper grades. She was not always the most comfortable person to work with on the board, because she was direct and she did not accept bad reasoning, but she was always the most effective. Milton watched all of this with the pride of a man who had known from a word in a letter what he was getting, and had never for a moment wished it different. James Walter Merritt grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and who took to ranching with a genuine love that made the question of succession an uncomplicated one. By the time he was 15, he was doing the work of a full hand, and doing it better than most, and he and Deke Albright, who was slowing now but still present and still essential, had a relationship that was one of the most affecting things Milton had ever witnessed. The old cowhand and the young rancher's son, the continuity of knowledge and character from one generation to the next, passing not through words but through the daily working of the land. Clara Ruth Merritt, who had had Augusta's face and Augusta's directness from her first moments in the world, grew into a girl who was academically brilliant in a way that made her Caldwell teachers write to Augusta and Milton in tones of respectful amazement. She read everything she could find in the house, which was considerable given the books Augusta had been ordering for years, and by the time she was 12, she had effectively exhausted the Caldwell School's library and was working through the lending library her mother had helped establish, and then writing away to publishers in Kansas City for more. Augusta and Milton talked about Clara's future with the seriousness the subject deserved, because they understood that they had a daughter of exceptional ability, and that the question of what she could do with that ability in the world as it existed was a real one. Augusta, who had herself been constrained and limited, and had pushed through the constraints with the force of her own nature, was not going to let the constraints define her daughter's future if she could help it. In 1898, when Clara was 12, Augusta wrote a letter to the principal of the Emporia Normal School asking about the possibilities for a young woman of exceptional academic preparation, and the response was encouraging enough that they began planning in earnest. But that was the future, and the present in the autumn of 1892, which is where the story is really settling, was a ranch on the Chicaskia River that was healthy and productive, and populated by two children who were loved and known and well prepared for their lives, and two people who had found each other through the honest medium of letters and had built something real on the Kansas plain. On the anniversary of their first meeting, the 14th of May, Augusta's arrival at the Caldwell station, Milton had, in the years since, made a practice of finding Augusta somewhere on the ranch or in the town, and giving her something that was specifically chosen, not expensive things but real ones. The first year a book of poetry she had mentioned admiring, the second year a good new saddle for the roan. The 6th anniversary, in May of 1888, he had given her a copy of her own first letter, which he had transcribed by the newspaper printer in a clean hand on good paper, framed in simple wood, with the single word "Relentless" emphasized in the center of the page. She had taken it and looked at it and then looked at him for a long moment and said, "You kept it." He said, "Every letter, from the first." She said, "I kept yours too." He said, "I know you did." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because you are relentless about the things that matter to you." She looked at the framed letter and then looked at him and said, "Where did you want to hang this?" He said, "Wherever you want it." She put it in the kitchen. Of course she put it in the kitchen. It hung there for the rest of their lives, on the wall above the work table where the morning light came through the south window, in the room where their most important conversations had always happened. A single word in the middle of a white page that had traveled from Missouri to Kansas in 1882 and had changed the shape of two lives in the changing. In the late spring of 1893, Augusta discovered she was expecting again, and told Milton with the same directness she always used, and held his hands across the kitchen table, and they were both very still for a moment with the particular reverence of people who understand that they are still receiving gifts. The third child, a boy, born in December 1893, named Thomas for no particular relative, but because it was a good solid name that suited him, was as different from his siblings as people can be while sharing the same parents. Where James was steady and Clara was brilliant, Thomas was joyful, deeply and constitutionally joyful in a way that lit up every room he entered, and that made Deke Albright, who was 63 now and whose knee had gotten worse but who still came to the ranch every day because it was where he belonged, look at the baby and then look at Milton and say, in his dry way, "This one is going to give you trouble." Milton said, "The good kind." Deke said, "Is there another kind?" Thomas Merritt did give them the good kind of trouble, the kind that came from a child who was so fully alive and so genuinely interested in everything that keeping up with him required more energy than the other two combined. He was the one who decided at age 3 that Oberon the first had passed peacefully at the age of 11, and his successor was a large brown dog of similar temperament, should sleep in the kitchen, and spent 2 weeks of sustained negotiation with Augusta on this point before being told, firmly and finally, that the dog slept in the barn and that this was the end of the conversation. Thomas said, "But Mama." Augusta said, "Thomas." Thomas, who had his mother's eyes and some considerable portion of her relentlessness, looked at her and recognized something he had come to understand as very young children understand the truly fundamental things, which was that there were negotiations to be had in the world, and then there were facts about the world, and his mother was a fact about the world, and that this was entirely fine because the fact was warm and good and was always, always in his corner. He said, "Yes, ma'am." Oberon II slept in the barn. The Merritt Ranch went on through the 1890s with the good constancy of a thing that has been built well and maintained honestly. Charlie Foss had 2 more children with Nell, and was running his own small operation on a property he had purchased 3 miles north, having saved the money over 7 years of work and careful living, and he and Milton maintained the easy working relationship of men who had grown to trust each other over a long time. Deke Albright, who was by 1895 more advisor than cowhand, continued to come to the ranch every morning and to be correct about things more often than not. The century-turned 1900 came to the Kansas plain with the particular feeling of a threshold crossed, though the cattle still grazed and the river still ran, and the sky was still the same extraordinary western sky that Augusta had looked at on her first evening and said she had not expected. And the Merritt family was still there, still on the land, still in the house with its addition, and its schoolroom and its kitchen where the framed letter hung above the worktable. Clara Ruth Merritt went to the Emporia Normal School in 1903, having spent 2 years preparing with a thoroughness that her instructors found almost intimidating, and she was the finest student in her entering class and became a teacher of distinction who eventually, in the second decade of the new century, became the principal of the Caldwell School itself, which Augusta received with a satisfaction that was too deep for ordinary pride. James Walter Merritt took over the operation of the ranch in the natural way that such things happen in good families, not through any formal transfer, but through the gradual shift of responsibility as his father's shoulders broadened into other things, and his own proved equal to carrying the weight. He married a young woman named Frances in 1904, a quiet and capable person from a neighboring county who understood cattle and cooking and landscape in equal measure, and who got along with Augusta from the first day in the way of 2 women who are both practical and both honest, and therefore have nothing to be defensive about with each other. Thomas Merritt, who had been the joyful one, the troublemaker in the good way, grew into a man of 20 who was beloved by everyone who knew him and who had inherited enough of his mother's relentlessness to keep his father from worrying too much. And he went west, further west, into New Mexico territory, and built his own life there, and wrote letters home that were long and detailed and warm, and that Augusta answered with letters that were shorter and precise, and that Thomas would say, later, were better than anything he had ever read. Deke Albright died in the winter of 1904, quietly in his sleep, in the bunkhouse where he had slept for 22 years, and he was buried on the north edge of the Merritt land, which was where he had asked to be buried in a single sentence on a single piece of paper that they found in his bedside drawer. Milton and Charlie Foss stood at the grave in the January cold, and both of them were very still for a long time. Augusta stood beside Milton and held his hand and said nothing, and understood that this was not a moment for words but for presence. Afterward, back in the kitchen, always the kitchen, Milton sat at the table and Augusta sat across from him, and he said, "He was the best man I ever worked with," she said. "He was, and he knew it about himself in the way that the best people do, not with pride but with clarity." Milton said, "He would have said that was your description of yourself." Augusta said, "He was not wrong. I think we recognize something in each other." Milton said, "2 of the clearest people I have ever known." She looked at him and said, "And you are the 3rd." He said, "Am I?" She said, "You have always known exactly who you were and what you needed, and you had the sense to say so in a letter and the patience to wait for an honest reply." He said, "I read your reply 4 times." She said, "I know you did. You told me in your reply it was the best thing you ever wrote." They sat in the kitchen in the winter light, the 2 of them, in the house they had built together and the life they had built together, and the word was still there on the wall in its plain frame, and outside the land was deep with January, and the river was running slow under its ice, and the cattle were in the winter pastures, and James and Frances were in the house, and there was a grandchild coming in the spring. And everything that had started with a letter and a word had grown into a life so full and so real that it required no embellishment and no apology. Augusta reached across the table and took his hand the way she had been taking it for 22 years, with the directness of a woman who knew what she wanted and had never been afraid to reach for it. She said, "I am glad you wrote back." He said, "I am glad you used that word." She said, "Which one?" He said, "You know which one." She did. She looked at him with the full expression of a woman who had been exactly who she said she was from the first letter to this morning and every morning in between, and she said, "So am I." Outside, the Kansas sky was doing what it always did, spreading itself out enormous and indifferent and beautiful above the flat plain and the river and the ranch and the two people at the kitchen table. And inside, in the warm kitchen with the framed letter on the wall and the coffee warm on the stove and the sound of Francis in the next room, and the cattle settled in the winter pastures, and everything accounted for, and everything resolved and everything real. Milton Merritt held his wife's hand and thought that there was not a single word he had read 4 times in his life that had meant more than the one she had chosen to describe herself, and that every single day since that letter had been the proof of it, and that the proof was still here, still growing, still real, and that it would be. He believed with the certainty of a man who had built carefully and honestly on good land, for a very long time to come.